Ethics is absolutely at the core of rebuilding trust. We need to be investing as a society, not just in our technical infrastructure and our physical infrastructure, but equally in the repair or strengthening of our ethical infrastructure. You can think that you're coming to a discussion with good faith, but be so locked into your own worldview and position that you are impervious to the influence of any other person. And in fact, you're not engaging with them really. Ethics can help you to understand the structure of the choices that people are making and to come to grips with why they might hold the views that they do.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Values and Interests podcast. Today, I'm particularly excited to share an interview that I conducted with Dr. Simon Longstaff. Simon is the Executive Director of the Ethics Center, an Australia-based nonprofit that focuses on putting ethics at the center of everyday life. Together, we had a wide-ranging conversation, talking about the power of moral inquiry, how to engage others in truly good faith even when you disagree, and we closed with a discussion on how ethics can help address global challenges such as climate change. So before we get into kind of the work and the mission and how you view applied ethics from that everyday life spectrum, I'd love to hear about kind of your own values formation and what brought you to a point where you wanted to make a career out of ethics.
Well, for myself, I consider myself still to be a work in progress. So it's not as if I've arrived at a terminal position. But the things that have really had a big influence in my life in terms of shaping who I am, there were some particular events like the death of my mother when I was a 7-year-old child, and that started me thinking about the world and how these things happen. And then there were particular experiences or exposures. So I grew up in Australia, where I was born. I used to spend part of my time in outback, that is rural Australia, on property, riding horses, chasing sheep, things like that, ploughing, all the rest of the things. And that was very formative. Left school when I was 16 and had no money, so I had to start work in order to be able to fund my way to do anything else in life. And my first job was as a cleaner and then later a safety officer on a manganese mine on a place called Groote Eylandt in the far north of Australia. And there one of the most important things happened, that I was adopted into the kinship structure of the Anandaliakwa people, who are First Nations people from Australia living in this very remote part of the world. So I've had an ongoing experience with them, and that's been tremendously formative of how I see the world and understanding it from a very different perspective than would typically have been the case had I not had that. And then I suppose the other really strong formative experience is through philosophy and just going to the point where I'd got sufficient grasp of it, particularly after doing postgraduate studies in Cambridge, and understanding how much I didn't really understand about it, even after I'd got quite a high degree. I had to unlearn a lot of it because it tends to give you a false appreciation of what philosophy is about. You think it's all about being smart and clever and winning in an argument and things like that. But as you get older and read it and reread it and dwell in it further, you learn a particular kind of humility which is essential to it. So you put all those things together, rural, remote, the indigenous effects, and then this kind of level of academic education. And I suppose all of those things, along with a million other things, family, getting married, all those things that make me the person I am today.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to hear about kind of your journey from this job in a mine to moral philosopher now. And I think that really showcases that philosophy is a very personal thing. Like, you can be that person working in the mine, struggling with it as much as somebody who's at an elite institution. And
well, that's really important, because one of the things I've always carried with me is I think some of the most profound conversations I've had were not in Cambridge, but with people who had never really finished any formal education. They were fitters and turners. They were really rough diamonds, if you like, and yet deeply invested in serious conversations about life and their place in it. And I think you never want to lose sight of just how important ideas can be, and wrestling with these questions for people right across the socioeconomic spectrum.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to write down that quote and have it framed somewhere here in terms of understanding what you don't understand. I think one of the best parts about my job at the council is I get to be a fly on the wall in so many of these conversations, and just, I try to take this sponge approach to it, and it's just, I feel very lucky to be at the council in that regard. So turning to the work of the Ethics Center specifically, I think when people see Carnegie Council's name and ethics, or literally the Ethics Center, and they think about kind of the times that we are living in, there can feel like the center itself or the institution itself is disjointed from the reality of the moment. But I think these institutions are more important than ever. So I'd love to hear about kind of the work of the institute, or the work of the Ethics Center, and then kind of framing it within the moment that we're living in right now.
Well, the first thing I suppose is about what we're not. So we're not a moral policeman. It's not as if the Ethics Centre has set itself up as some kind of judge and jury around what is good or bad in terms of the decisions people make. Rather, it's there to deal with the questions that people have in genuinely complex times and provide frameworks and opportunities for thinking through to come at an answer which every individual or organisation can live with, because ultimately they have to make the choice. And so the Ethics Centre, which was established as a charitable endeavour in Sydney, unfortunately was set up without any endowment or anything. So the only way it's survived is by constantly proving itself to be relevant to the community. And that's had a particular dynamic which has led the Ethics Centre to be unique. And its uniqueness lies in two things. Firstly, it deals with everything from preparing soldiers to go to war. So our Australian forces, when they were deployed alongside people, say from the US, to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, we made a point with our regular forces at least of making sure that every soldier who was deployed had thickened up, if you like, their ethical skin so that they could be ready for the abrasive effects of combat, where it's asymmetric, and that generates a whole series of different dimensions. At the other end of the life and death spectrum that we work between are end-of-life decisions in hospitals, where you might be a family member of someone who's reaching the end of their life, unable to speak for themselves. And there's a really critical distinction that you may not be aware of between, on the one hand, using technology to prolong life, which of course is a noble aspiration, but you can use exactly the same technology to make someone just die very slowly. And I've never met anyone who said, oh, I want my loved one to die as slowly as possible. And yet often when you have this kind of heroic syndrome within aspects of the medical fraternity, they won't tell you that there's that difference, and you can inadvertently become complicit in something that you would never choose and that your loved one would never choose. So in between those two extremes of life and death, we deal with sport and government and commerce, both at the organisational or institutional level, and also very much at the personal level. And that's the second unique component, in that we operate what is still the world's only free national helpline for people who have ethical issues. And so we have everyone from cabinet ministers in our federal government to farmers and policemen who, if they're just uncertain, caught in the moment, can come somewhere to be helped. And the last thing I'll say is that we also have a very strong program of public engagement through things like the Festival of Dangerous Ideas and our publications, again designed to push the boundaries to some degree so that you can maintain as large a possible middle space where reasonable people can come to debate issues, not necessarily to agree. And instead of shutting everything down, we want to create a place where it's safe to challenge ideas, not to be safe from ideas.
And it's so interesting to hear you talk about, I guess, make the case for the efficacy of ethics and the intervention points you highlighted specifically around combat and end of life, because these are situations that really reframe your value system, right? These are things you thought you wouldn't have to deal with, and now it's kind of looking at you straight in the face in terms of these really difficult moral choices. We think about this a lot at Carnegie Council more from a geopolitical perspective, but the values and interest calculus is always there in terms of it being shaped by the environment that you are in. And it's very interesting kind of backing up and thinking about that from a more universal perspective, and having your helpline almost being that point of universalism where the teacher and the police officer are kind of dealing at the most basic level with the same things, even though they might manifest in a different way. So I was interested to maybe now go back to kind of ethics at a higher level and kind of your approach to ethics from either a universal perspective or a pluralistic perspective. What's the organizing principle there for how you think about applied ethics?
So ethics is clearly a branch of philosophy, and philosophy for thousands of years across multiple cultures have been wrestling with very deep questions that humans confront. And everything from the nature of truth and beauty and existence and things through to what ethics focuses on, which is really the structure of human choice and how it shapes the world. Because when you just look around your world, everything could be other than what it is, but for the fact that someone made a choice to create it this particular way, whether it's an institution, a piece of technology, even the way we dress, everything like that. And so over the millennia in ethics, what we've been able to do is to invent, if you like, the equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, which could be used for all sorts of different purposes, but always both to understand the deepest structure of human choice, and then having that understanding in hand to be able to assist people then to reflect on the choices that they have before them and have a range of tools for assessing them in a way which supports a life which isn't just conventionally lived, by which I mean it's not just a life in which you do things because everyone does it that way or you've always done it, which can be a moral life in a sense because you can be habitually committed to all sorts of values and principles. But the ethical life is distinguished from that by being an examined life in the sense that Socrates talked about. And so this is what that branch of philosophy is doing. It's very much about practicalities because the decisions you confront can't be avoided. You can't just sit there refusing to do it. I suppose you could, but that's a choice in itself. And it's about providing structured means so that people can particularly be assisted to avoid some of the pitfalls of making a choice in a blind sense, not seeing things as they really are. And that's really what's been unfolding over the thousands of years that we've been working on these questions.
So I think you bring up some very interesting points in terms of what ethics actually is in terms of it being a tool to live a more reflective and a better life, right? A more reflective life. But I think from a public understanding perspective, there are kind of two camps. You have that's to ivory tower and that's moral philosophy and I didn't go to university and get my PhD, so I'm not going to touch that. And then the other side, it's a conflation with minimal standards or something punitive, somebody acted some way and violated ethics. But you're thinking through it in a much more, I would say, personal and dynamic way. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the challenges of messaging ethics to kind of the general population right now and how you think about that at the Ethics Center.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in characterising those two views, which are very strongly expressed and have been for a long time. The first thing I think about everyday life, I mean, ethical questions are sometimes put in this box. Someone say, a discussion about whether or not to support voluntary assisted dying, and they'll say, that's an ethical question. But equally, if you go to the supermarket and you're looking at what eggs to buy, you've got a choice. You're going to buy the eggs that come from birds which have free range and they live reasonable life as a chook, or are you going to buy those that live in cages? Now, you're doing ethics. If you stop for a moment and say, which one should I buy? And you've got to balance things like price and availability and things. But the moment you stop and do that, you're doing ethics. So it touches this very day-to-day kind of consideration you're doing. Unless you want to simply resign yourself to saying, I'm never going to think about the world and live. I'm just going to. And it's not that you won't be driven by a set of values and principles. It's just that you'll be driven by ones over which you have no control at all. You're like a kind of automaton that's wandering around. That's one end. The other end, and this is one which I think can be particularly strong in certain cultural environments, is a reduction of ethics to a kind of set of rules or codes. But then, of course, the moment you stop and ask, where did those rules come from? And how should they be applied? And what are the exceptions? And what do we do when they require different things, pulling us in opposite sometimes directions? Then you understand that it can't be just that. And so what I constantly do, and I think what any of us who are interested in ethics, like the Carnegie Foundation can do, is just present it to people and say, look, let's start off with something which is really obvious, that we can all agree, which we have choices, that these choices matter. And if you're interested in knowing how to make better choices, and not have someone tell you what to do, but equip you with the capacity to make better choices, then we're here to do that, to assist you.
Yep.
And we sort of make a bet that on average, better choices will make for a better world.
Yeah, no, I think ownership over your personal, and then how we would see it at the council, your political reality, and that requires reflection. We think about ethics, again, through the lens of geopolitics, but through 3 dimensions. So it's reckoning with the ends and the means, but also the consequences. And I think that goes to your everyday life example, in that even if you have the what you might think as an individual as the clearest moral crystal ball, you do not understand the consequences of your choice. You can to an extent, but there is something to be reckoned with. There is a consequence to be reckoned with. And so we very much think about the ends and means equation, but every decision is going to lead to another decision, is going to lead to another decision. And I think a lot of times people, especially in the geopolitical space, reduce it to that. I made an initial decision, and at least I did it responsibly, and now I can wash my hands of it. And I think that's a big tension point right now in both politics and geopolitics for us.
Yeah, well, we also dabble in the geopolitical side as well, particularly in issues involving the military and other services. And you get people from a range of different cultures. And so we would bring people together from, say, Pakistan in the west through to China in the east and the Pacific and all the rest, and start to have these conversations. And firstly, you start to see that, particularly when you're dealing with people from the profession of arms, where they're right at the pointy end of some of these decisions, some of which they don't actually control themselves because they're made by the political class. They really understand not just the effects that they are going to create, but also the unintended consequences that they might have to live with, because they are putting people in harm's way. They understand all of the implications in a very gritty way for what's done. And so it's not as if the world stops for this process of endless deliberation. That's not how the world operates. But what you can do is make yourself better prepared to deal with these challenges in the way that you've described. And that can be incredibly useful both for the individual, who is protected then from some of the effects of bad decisions, such as the moral injury that people can suffer. But it also makes it better for even your adversaries to understand that there is some kind of framework which is in application at the time, by which people are thinking, and that makes it slightly more predictable in even the most chaotic environment such as war. Yeah.
No, I think we have a long tradition of looking at those questions in terms of norms being developed around maybe what more just action in war might look like, and really reckoning with those questions. But even from a diplomacy perspective, being transparent about your moral framework for your adversary allows for better conditions to engage with that person, and naturally to doing that in a good faith effort that's not purely political or economic or power driven. And so that actually leads to kind of my next question, which is really, and we've talked about this the past few days as you visit us at the council, but it's this concept of good faith. And that being a critical piece of the equation, not only in coming to ethical reflection as an individual in good faith, but finding other people to engage with. So I'd love to hear kind of how you think about good faith and how this interacts with the process of applied ethics.
Well, I did mention one of the things in my own formation that I eventually had to learn, it took me a while, is about this importance of humility and the kind of curiosity about the world that comes with that. You can think that you're coming to a discussion with good faith, but be so locked into your own worldview and position that you are impervious to the influence of any other person. And in fact, you're not engaging with them really. All you're trying to do is to prove your point, to win your part of the argument. I don't consider that really to be either practically effective, but it certainly doesn't make my test of what is good faith. I think if you approach someone or some other person with good faith, what you're able to do is to listen to them with the degree of intent and sincerity such that when you replay to them what you've heard them say, they say, yes, you've got it. Which means that you've got to be open to their ideas in some sense, and also to the possibility that you might adjust your position in the light of something that they're going to say. And likewise, if another person on the other side of the conversation is got a similar disposition, then in almost anything that you can think of, you're likely to have a more productive conversation, because people are then they're open at least to making some kind of adjustment to their position, which isn't just brought about by the application of blunt force, but by reason, consideration, and by the creative possibility that something between those different positions may have been better than either of them by themselves. Now, when you do that, as I say, it's partly a disposition, a genuineness to engage. Maybe there's some skills in it too, in terms of like learning to listen and all the rest. What you're doing is you're forging new possibilities, or at least you're allowing for these possibilities to emerge in the way that doesn't happen otherwise. And I can't think of a thorny issue, either in individual personal life or in geopolitics or anything else, where that isn't better than the alternative.
Yes, interesting to hear you say that. I keep coming back, in my work here at the council, I keep coming back to either the search for good faith actors or thinking about forums to optimize kind of a good faith environment. And that seems to be one of the essential things in the work of the council, especially when you're working on very thorny political issues and across different cultures and value sets, and these things that require international cooperation and governance. And you're never going to go 10 for 10 and bringing the good faith individuals in the room. But I found in my years here, it's a good North Star at least.
Well, sometimes you can help create the conditions.
Yep.
So you might have two parties who seem to be hostile to each other's point of view. They're dug in, they're defensive. It's like the equivalent of the arms crossed, not willing to listen to anything. And I think you can characterise a lot of politics like that, geopolitics the same. When you have a disinterested third party who is not concerned about winning the argument for one side or the other, say someone like the Carnegie Council, that is a very powerful thing. Actually, in some senses, your own vulnerability, the fact that you're not a powerful government or something, can be a real source of strength, because you threaten no one. It's not as if you can impose a solution. It's not as if you've got any power to constrain or to maintain. You're just there, disinterested, relatively weak except for the influence you might bear in terms of creating the conditions where the other parties can unfold their arms a little, maybe listen, and even be helped in some senses to hear what the other party is saying in a way that isn't filtered by assumptions that are already built into their position.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, ironically, we are in a situation politically, globally, where you see the safe civic spaces shrinking when supply and demand requires more of them at this period of time. But I think fully aligned there in terms of...
Well, that's why you have to be brave.
Yep.
I mentioned this thing we created years ago called the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. It really does push genuinely dangerous ideas. I mean, when people come, they get outraged from right across the political spectrum. But it's done for a serious moral purpose, and it's to counteract that tendency you just described, which is about a shrinking of that space where reasonable people can come. And they might be engaged in principled disagreement, but at least they're listening. And the more that we within the world try to preserve those places, the better chance there is that things don't collapse into a very dangerous state where people are just armed and hostile in opposition rather than listening.
Yeah, I think about that a lot from a personal perspective, and it's kind of osmosis in working here, that I want to be comfortably uncomfortable, right? And that is balancing, you want to be a good father, you want to be a good husband, you want to provide and, have a safe family, but you also want to push yourself, right? Especially in this moment politically. So I think the council, and I'm sure the Ethics Center, provides a lot of people with the environment to do that, to feel uncomfortable and to be exposed to other ideas and in doing it hopefully in a safe civic space. So,
well, this is the distinction I alluded to earlier. I mean, a lot of people, particularly in the last 30 years, of trying to create spaces where they're safe from the world. So at least that part of the world they don't agree with. Whereas what I think we're both involved in is trying to create spaces where it's safe to engage in these issues.
Yep.
And do so knowing that, yes, it may be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not going to be something that breaks you.
Yep.
It's more likely it's something that's going to allow you to flourish a little more for having been engaged.
Yeah. No, I always think about the example of like, it's not fun to go to the gym, but you feel better in a month's time. You feel better in 2 months' time, etc. And I constantly always tell myself that when I'm maybe reading a piece of literature or philosophy here that takes me about 10 times to grasp, but it's good to do the mental workout. So I think we've talked a lot about kind of the applied ethics from both kind of a larger political perspective, but also an individual perspective. And I think one of the issues that is across the spectrum right now for all of us is climate change. And so I wanted to pivot a bit to that and really kind of go into your Swiss Army knife that you talked about before, and what within that, what are the tools do you think can be leveraged right now to really think about unlocking greater progress around this issue of climate, both from an individual perspective, but then more, I would say, globally?
Well, I think we've touched on some of the key elements around climate change. One is that you've got people who see a dangerous situation becoming more dangerous more quickly, and there's an urgency in their concerns. Equally, there are people who have vested interests who feel threatened by this. And I'm not talking here about big companies, in the fossil fuel. I'm just talking about ordinary people who feel that their own lives are going to be turned upside down. So we're starting with a situation where it's a global problem. So we've got all of the issues of multicultural approaches to these things. It's an urgent issue, at least for some. And that tends to put people into very hard positions. Hardened positions might be better, in which they are driven, impelled by their sense of concern to lecture to others, if you like, about how the world must be different, to take action, to protest and all the rest. And what I think the Swiss Army knife of ethics can do is it's say, actually, whichever side of these questions you're on, there are better ways by which to engage. So, for example, ethics can help you to understand the structure of the choices that people are making and to come to grips with why they might hold the views that they do. It can help you deploy a series of lenses for both understanding those perspectives but also communicating, which will be far more effective because they take into account the diverse ways that we think about the world and what we consider to be legitimate, and allow you to explain yourself in ways that will actually be heard. Not just because you're shouting louder, but because people say, oh yes, I can recognise myself in that. It can allow you to position yourself so that you have more people who are, in a sense, compelled to take seriously what you say because you take them seriously, in the way that we were just talking about. And so, at a very, very practical level, if you learn the skills of this, whichever side you start on, you're likely to find yourself better able to make sense of the situation you confront, but also to communicate with others about what you're trying to do. And all of that means that many of the points of resistance for change can actually start to melt away. So I'll just give you one very simple but potent example which has emerged from our conversations. I think that one of the biggest blockages to any kind of progress on a topic like climate change, and many others for that matter, is the very significant collapse in trust. Trust in government, in politics, in institutions, whether they're private or public. And that collapse in trust has been precipitous because it's happened where a whole lot of institutions have more or less fallen over like dominoes, pretty much within a very short period of time. And it means that you might be a person who agrees that a certain course of action, say around climate change, might be desirable. It could be to do with the rollout of renewables or something like that. And you may even think that this would be good for you, but you just don't trust the world to ensure that both the burdens and the benefits of change will be equitably distributed. You'll say, oh, I know what'll happen. Once again, I'll be left having to carry the costs, or someone else enjoys all the benefits. And so you say, don't do it. I'm not going to take that risk, even though you are compelled by reason or experience to think it would be a good idea. Ethics is absolutely at the core of rebuilding trust. And I would argue that in this question and in others, we need to be investing as a society, not just in our technical infrastructure and our physical infrastructure, but equally in the repair or strengthening of our ethical infrastructure. Because without that being healthy, all the other things produce suboptimal outcomes.
Now, there's a great, I'm not using it in a positive way, but just a strong tension right now in terms of, especially for those aligned more politically with the left, how to save or reinforce institutions. And there's a great debate over whether this is a grassroots moment or a leadership top-down moment. And, you've kind of offered a third lane here, that we need kind of the ethics ecosystem to be equally strong, the third pillar of the stool there. And I could not agree more. I think there are arguments on both ends of the spectrum, but ethics seems to be in the middle there, a more moderate reflection of society.
Strangely enough, the most conservative people should be the ones who care most about the strength of institutions, because they're all about seeing evolution rather than revolution. And people from the left should be concerned too that they've got a kind of infrastructure which allows a just and orderly kind of transition, if that's to come, or a more equitable society, however one thinks about that. What ethics does is it positions, as you've suggested, us in another space where it's not about holding fast to a political position or whatever, but you look at it and you take a much more, I think, serious-minded but open-minded approach. Because I think people who at the moment object to the way society has gone, in every case there will be a serious point to be grasped. This is the thing that so often when you look at the great currents in politics, whether they're geopolitics or within national environments, the voices you hear are often extreme and polarised, but there's a germ of truth that they're holding, which has been lost. It's been buried under all of the rhetoric and the rage at not having been heard. And so if you take people seriously and find what is that grain of truth and let it be expressed, then people say, they let go, they're open then, and then you start to have
they feel seen.
Yeah, and you have such a more productive conversation and an opportunity for moving forward than you would otherwise have achieved.
So I wanted to close, again, focused on climate, but in terms of how you are seeing the space right now, do you feel hopeful? Are you on the opposite end of the spectrum? And if you had a blank check to really, I would say, infuse ethics into a certain point to address this issue of climate, where should that energy be? And maybe people who are listening, working in the social good space, can kind of take that and run with it.
So I tend to be an optimist. I think the best description I would have for myself is a pragmatic idealist. So I have a sense of what things could be, but I'm also very much focused on what works. So the biggest gap, I think, for those who are working in, we'll take climate as the focus, is not to do with dispositions or outlooks. I think it's a lack of skill. So I would be saying that what ethics is not just about a feeling about things, nor is it just about a kind of purely intellectual engagement. There are skills to be learned. And I would be saying that those people who care about climate, or any other topic for that matter, if you were to devote some time and energy to developing hard, practical skills that ethics has to offer, and let's assume that they're available, that people to help you do that, then I'd be doing that. Because I think you're far more likely to achieve your ends by skillful means than just by any means at all.
No, that's a great point to end on. It's a personal experience that I've had since working at the council, where I feel like I have the Swiss Army knife in my pocket and I'm walking around with it as a dad, as a professional, as a husband. So you can see the knock-on effect even when you're not at your desk. So this has been great, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us on Values and Interests.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.